thank you so much for kicking us off with a wonderful presentation there. So I will turn now to Professor Nick Pidgeon. Nick is Director of Understanding Risk Research Group within the School of Psychology at Cardiff University, and also the Professor of Environmental Risk. And his research looks at public attitudes, risk perception, and public engagement with environmental risks, emerging technologies such as GM, nanotechnologies, climate engineering, climate change, and energy systems. So, you know, all the controversies there. He's a fellow of the Society of Risk Analysis and was awarded an honorary fellowship of the British Science Association in 2011 and an MBE in the 2014 Queen's Birthday Honours for services to climate change awareness and energy security policy. He chaired the 2006 Cross-Party Parliamentary Inquiry, whose report "Is a Cross-Party Consensus on Climate Change Possible or Desirable?", which recommended the setting up of the UK Climate Change Committee. He is a co-investigator in the UK Energy Research Centre and has held numerous science advisory roles in the UK government departments over the past 25 years. He was one of the first social scientists to empirically investigate societal attitudes towards climate engineering in the UK, using both surveys and deliberative workshops as part of the integrated assessment of geoengineering project. So Nick, I'm delighted to welcome you here. Thank you very much. Over to you. You are still muted.
Yeah, you had to have one speaker who did that, didn't you? You can see my screen.
Just to make sure we're paying attention. Yeah,
I know.
We can see your screen.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Thank you for a really fulsome introduction. That was very kind of you. And thank you to the academies as well for the opportunity to come and talk here about our work. And I'd like really to talk about. Oh, that's interesting. That's not moved. Yes, it has. Has that changed? Yeah. Four things: nuclear discourse and what we've called reluctant acceptance. It was mentioned actually in the previous session briefly, and there is some empirical evidence for that. What we find when we look with the local nuclear communities, then engaging publics with energy system change as a whole, because I think it's important to bear in mind that the choice here is not nuclear or not. It's nuclear within a basket of other things, and whether that is in some sense acceptable, or the conditions under which it would be acceptable alongside other things. And then beliefs about climate change. And I guess my work complements Brooks and Seth's to some extent well, in that this is trying to answer some of the questions about where are citizens coming from in relation to this technology, in terms of recent empirical work. Now, I thought I'd show this just to make the point that these are drawings that ordinary members of the public did for us at the start of a workshop, I think, on energy storage, but we asked them to start to think about where their energy came from. And it said draw it, and they thought we were rather strange doing this, but it brought a number of really interesting pictures. And the point it makes is that people have their own views of where energy comes from, and what the energy system is, what the elements of it are. And from a decision science perspective, you have to sort of start there. You have to understand where people are coming from before you can start any of that conversation about a new technology. In fact, only one person, somebody from Scotland, I think here, mentioned a nuclear power plant in 30 or 40 interviews we did there. But I just mentioned that as people are not a tabula rasa in all of this. Where were we up to about 2000? I think we've heard some of this already, but following the 3 Mile Island Chernobyl disasters in the USA and many European countries, very strong opposition, various associations we've heard about going back into history. Distrust was very important. I think the social scientists picked up on this in the surveys, that you find people who show distrust of those who manage or regulate it, or the government to regulate it, are much less accepting of nuclear energy. But from a sociological perspective, we may hear that tomorrow, the whole question of distrust is quite complex and subtle. It's not a simple one-dimensional thing. Local and national benefits matter a lot. And then finally, I think the thing in red at the bottom there, this really has to be thought through carefully. There's no one public attitude to nuclear. That's why sometimes social scientists talk about publics. It can sound a bit clunky in the way it is put in research articles, but there are multiple publics around this. So demographics and values matter. The context and conditions that people find themselves in, or choice about energy technology, and also the issue framing all matter in relation to these questions. So shifting nuclear discourses and reluctant acceptance, this is work we did between 2000 and 2010. Some of you, that's The Economist from, I think, 2007, around about the time of the IPCC fourth report and the Stern report from the UK government. And there was a feeling at that time, not just in the UK, but certainly in Europe and parts of the US, that there was a new age coming for nuclear power, and that having suffered the setbacks of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, then maybe the time was right to think again about renewal of the industry in some way. In the UK, and this has been well documented, Simon Taylor's got a lovely book cited at the bottom, The Fall and Rise of Nuclear Power in Britain. I think you could see that debate play out in quite a sort of public way, that a number of actors reframed nuclear energy as a part solution to climate change and energy security. We had declining gas reserves coming along the horizon. So will renewable sources be sufficient? Nuclear power brings reliability, low carbon in operation. There are other issues on a life cycle basis that clearly that doesn't meet. And the impacts of this effort, I think, and that also involved one or two prominent environmentalists as well were making this argument as well at that time. And so the impacts of this was detectable in the UK and national surveys. The people who did tracking, you could see sort of year in, year out, there was a very gradual increase in the numbers who were more accepting of nuclear energy. But it's important that I think culture and values also matter to beliefs, and it was not a case that people suddenly overnight became pro the technology. It's a much more balanced and complex, nuanced position. This is from a couple of our very big surveys, GB samples, 1,000 in 2010, 2005, and you can just see at the bottom there, the 2010, 2005, we need nuclear power, and there's just a small increase over that period, but it's a significant increase, 7 points on acceptance in relation to the overall. But on the same survey, of course, we ask promoting renewable energy sources such as solar and wind is a better way of tackling climate change, and you get an overwhelming endorsement of that. And at first sight, that might seem contradictory, but in fact, it shows some of the complexity of the discourse that people broadly favor when put in context renewable technologies. But then when they start to think about it and think about some of the constraints on those technologies, would potentially be prepared to accept some nuclear energy as well. And how you ask the question matters in surveys, so you have to be very careful about concluding from any single question what's going on out there. I think that's the other lesson from some of that research. At the same time, I prefer to do, or to put the surveys alongside qualitative work. So at the same time, we were doing focus groups with members of the public. In fact, they were paired groups. So on one evening, a group would talk about climate change, and the second evening, they talked, in fact, about radioactive waste as a separate issue. And then right at the end of the whole process, we said to people, well, along the line here, some people have said there might be a link between these two issues because rad waste comes from nuclear power. And that some people have argued that might help with climate change. What do you think about it? So the last 10 minutes was focused on that. And that was the most illuminating part of the whole piece of research, because people suddenly came up with a whole group of trade-offs between the two issues. So putting them side by side was a very valuable thing to do. There are 3 quotes here, I won't read them out. Paul is stating the thing you tend to get, which is sort of these scientists, do they really know what's going on with this technology? There's kind of uncertainty, surely. However good they are, there are going to be risks. And then Martin sort of says, well, there are trade-offs, there are risks of both. And then now and again in a focus group, you get somebody who sums it all up completely. So the one at the bottom, having a head-on collision with a truck, that's with a truck or a tree, that's climate change or nuclear power. The best option is possibly the tree, but I still wouldn't want to do it. So the idea that you wouldn't want either of them given the choice. So that's what we called reluctant acceptance in that research, and that's been found elsewhere. And there's been research in the US by Mike Greenberg and others which have confirmed that here as well. Local nuclear communities are a different group, although that view exists there as well, for sure. and it's often argued, and to some extent there is evidence of this, that local nuclear communities who have existing facilities are more positive about nuclear power. Broadly, to some extent, there's some truth in that. So we did a very large study, involved a number of longitudinal, a number of interviews, in-depth interviews with local residents living around 3 with nuclear sites, plus some survey work as well. And bringing that all together, what we learned actually was each site was subtly different. So in economic and historical terms, so you had to treat each one on its own terms and own merits. There was more support for nuclear, but it was quite complex, not just pro or anti. It was, in fact, the anti people were far more anti and the pro people were far more pro in these local locations. But on balance, more of the community was for nuclear, and there were 1 or 2 other positions existing there as well. Benefits mattered, and trust in local managers, and I'll come on to that in a second. But we all found that anxieties about safety always existed, even if people felt fully confident about the local managers and about the benefits of the plants locally. And I'll show you a couple of quotes here. So on the sort of, this is a familiar technology, we've lived here forever. There were 3 kind of things that came up. It's been there all the time, and I've never really worried about it. So that's Sophie. And then sort of benign constructions, so interesting, symbolizing home. And that's not just a phenomenon with nuclear, some other otherwise maybe stigmatized technologies in some places can symbolize home if they're the first thing you see or the first thing you come across as you're returning from a long trip away. So that's kind of interesting. And then finally, the final point, which I interpreted as trust was a long-standing thing that nobody was actually working on trust. It was just that your kids went to school with the kids of the nuclear workers, or you met the nuclear workers in the pub or the restaurant, and they would be talking about the technology. And over time, or maybe you did have members of your family who worked at the plant. And that whole set of discourses, the interaction between the staff at the plant and the local community became very important basis for building trust. And you can see the quote there as well. So that's a taken for granted present. But in almost every interview, about 60 interviews here we did in depth, somebody could recount a point where they felt very cold about the plant. It might have been when 9/11 occurred, you'd see it on the news, or the equivalent 7/7 bombings in London, or where there'd been a major exercise at the plant, and nobody had alerted the local population in advance. So this we labelled an extraordinary risk, or after Joe Masco's book, The Nuclear Uncanny, that there was still something about the technology that had this kind of fear or dread, that even for those who lived there, and most of the time felt very comfortable about living there, could be triggered by external events or things that were happening at the plant. Okay, Kirsty asked me to talk about our work on putting nuclear in context. I've mentioned that right at the start. So my view is it's not about just nuclear, it's about engaging publics with the energy system as a whole. And this whole idea is there a kind of a social contract for change around the energy system. What we did here was a very large project. It's involved in-depth workshops in a number of locations around the UK, as well as survey again. There's several reports and papers are available from that project. What we did, we faced people with both demand side and supply side choices, the whole thing, and how this might potentially change different pathways of change for the whole energy system of the UK. And the overall set of results suggested there were a set of values that people wanted the energy system of the future should meet, and that would then help them to guide, or help them to judge what acceptability was. So at the top, you've got the 2 meta values. People wanted us to reduce the use of finite resources. They think we're just kind of, plundering the planet, and that really needs to stop. Which is one of the reasons why fossil fuels have a bad reputation, and reducing the overall levels of energy use. And then a whole bunch of other values were there in the bottom left-hand corner, for example. You've got to do things in a fair or just way. For example, avoiding waste there as well. People having choice and control and autonomy and freedom, respecting that. And then the interesting one at the bottom, long-term trajectories, people definitely said, somebody's got to have a plan for an interconnected way in which this whole system changes and works together. And so I guess that's the caution for new technology developers, that as well as meeting things like safety and economic goals, you have to also, to some extent, meet people's values. So you could find an otherwise very strongly supported technology like solar power. People generally like solar power, but if it's developed in a way that, for example, produces injustices in a local population or in a country where it's actually being done, then people will be much less accepting of that technology. So it's the values are actually setting the context for acceptability. So with nuclear, you've got some negatives. In our report, we talked about this. Obviously, waste, safety were the two things that came up. But then, interestingly, was nuclear sufficient to deal with the long-term issue, in the sense that the long-term issue was really about fossil fuels? It wasn't not about necessarily having new nuclear power plants, and therefore was it solving the long-term problem? On the plus, you've got obviously reliability. The interconnected thing was interesting, that people were sort of saying, well, maybe we should have some, but only if you're really working hard to get a lot of renewable energy and to remove fossil fuels from the system. So people could envisage a world where nuclear fitted in with that, but that's kind of the idea of having a system approach. And then environmental protection could go either way. The climate change argument is a more pro argument that people felt, but of course the waste argument is still a very significant question with nuclear. We also did something quite innovative. I mean, the whole project, I think nobody had done this before, to try and present citizens with a whole country decarbonising, meeting energy decarbonisation targets as a whole, and trying to get them to reflect upon the different trade-offs. Within both the workshops and the survey, we used something that that's called the My 2050 calculator. This is the version we used. There's a new one now. It's been updated by our Department of Energy. It's worth going to have a look at. You can go and play with it. I mean, it allows a participant to change 14 levers, 7 on the supply side, and you can see there nuclear power is highlighted in blue, and then 7 on the demand side. And depending on what you decide, so home temperature, that's settings home temperature at various levels. At the top here, you start at 100%, and then you're trying to meet the at that time 20% target of carbon emissions compared to the 1990 baseline. And you have to play about with the levers. There's extra information embedded within each of the levers to allow you to arrive at the target if possible. And it in a way, it allows people to make trade-offs between the different aspects of the system. So you might, I mean, for example, one of the things, biofuels, you have to choose quite a bit of biofuels and you can't meet the target. And that actually is implying greenhouse gas removal somewhere along the line with carbon capture and storage. So people were free to choose either no nuclear power through to a very high level of nuclear power. And those are actually the 4 levels of nuclear power that were there embedded in the tool. And what you found was, when put into context with both the supply and the demand options that people could take to try and meet the target, then nuclear power certainly was not rejected. The modal response was actually lever effort 1, which basically kind of translated to very large stations on the existing nuclear sites. I think that's the way so there wasn't a desire for very high expansion of nuclear power, but equally, unlike some of the other technologies or choices, so home efficiency, business greenness, wind on sea, wind on land, and biofuels, it certainly was not as well chosen by the participants. I should say there's been so that was a few years ago that we did that as really the first time that had ever been done anywhere. Still worth reading that report, but the Climate Assembly UK, which reported last year, sort of was designed on a similar model. So you can go and have a look at their report as well, and some fairly similar findings from the UK Climate Assembly, which was organised by the Climate Change Committee in the UK Parliament, and there's a very in-depth report there on the web. Then finally, and then I'll finish, there's been this debate about, well, as climate change becomes more serious, as people become concerned about climate change, how will beliefs about climate change affect views on technologies like nuclear power? Now, a few years ago, one of Brooks' colleagues, Paul Slovic, at Decision Research, about 25 years ago, did a very large survey with colleagues in France, in Simlog, in Paris, a US-France comparison broadly nuclear power and energy choices. And they had 1 or 2 questions about climate change, and buried deep within a report and an annex somewhere, there was a little correlation between people's beliefs about climate change and beliefs about nuclear power. And it was mild, but it was negative. So it said that the more people concerned about climate change, the less supportive they were of nuclear power. And that struck me thinking when I saw it, would that occur in other samples? And indeed it does. We have data going back for a few years, but this is a more recent European data. It's post-Fukushima. And it shows in Germany, Norway, France, and the UK. In Germany, Norway, and France, there's a strong majority opposed to nuclear power, and even in France, where they have very high levels of the technology. And actually, in France, that finding you'll find in data going back a number of years. In the UK, it's the other way around. There's sort of just about more people are positive than negative. Depends how you ask the question there, and that has remained so. So the UK wasn't affected in quite the same way by Fukushima as some of the other European countries were. But again, on that survey, we had an item about nuclear energy, and we had an indexed concern about climate change. And you'll see there for all 4 countries, the regression line there is negative. So it shows that as people, again, it's a mild effect. It's not a very high correlation between 0.1 and 0.2. But as people become more concerned about climate change, they actually become less supportive of nuclear energy. I think the explanation of this is an underlying worldview that sits behind there, that particularly if you're very environmentally concerned, it's always been the case that opposition to nuclear energy has been there within parts of the environmental movement. And so it's therefore, if you're concerned about climate change as an environmentalist, you're probably not supportive of nuclear energy. And that traditionally has always been there. And I'm sure that's partly where that negative correlation comes from. That's my final slide, and that was provided by University of Oklahoma, Jenkins Smith and Gupta, who have been tracking attitudes to nuclear in the US for a number of years now. You can see on the top there, 2006 through to 2020, and they've asked about support for new plants and support for plants in existing nuclear sites, and the latter is a higher, that's the dark dots, the dark black dots, compared to new locations. So people seem to think that's congruent with all our research from the UK, that they should be located on existing sites. And you will see Fukushima did affect views in the US. In the UK, this would have it went down for a bit and then it came back up again. But here in the US, it has remained, public support has remained at 50% on their measure. They've asked about small modular reactors, and I think we may get to talk about this a bit more, but I'm not entirely sure the question they asked. And there is a genuine issue about when it's a really new upstream technology, how much information you need to give people before they will come to an informed preference. So we can talk about that in questions. But here again, similar to exactly the same as our graph, they show people who are concerned about climate change and support for nuclear technology, and you've got a negative correlation again. So you've got a similar finding in the US. And I think, I wanted to just say this. I think we now don't have the data, which is not a very helpful thing to bring to a National Academies meeting. But just reflect on this. The last 2, 3, 4, 5 years has seen some pretty seismic events. We're all looking on the news at New Orleans and Louisiana currently, but a year ago we were looking at California and Australia as well. We've had flooding and flooding and heat wave events in Europe as well. Aside from that, of course, the climate change protests have really galvanized and there's been a huge change in public views on climate change over the last 2 to 3 years. That's well documented in both the US and in parts of Europe. But then we've also got this stressed political fabric sitting here. In the UK, the Brexit debate brought this out, this terrible polarization on various lines around that question. And I suppose my question for the panel here and everybody is, what's the role of this technology and what's the role of the change of the energy system, given both the extreme weather the protests that we've got, and clearly a lot of angry young people out there about this issue, but also our stressed political system. And I don't have a simple answer to that. It would be very interesting to know how members of the public are viewing nuclear technology under these circumstances. And I'm not sure we yet have the data to answer that question. Just to acknowledge some colleagues. I probably talked to slightly longer than I should have, but thank you for the opportunity to speak.
That was a tour de force. Fantastic. Thank you, Nick. Thank you so much. So much here.